In garages, schoolrooms, small towns and cities, around campfires in deserts, startups and universities, people are connected and changing our reality. Rather than top-down control, it's open collaboration. Rather than power for the few, it's spread amongst many. And although nobody's certain how the future will unfold, why not help write it and have a say in how it's told?
Well, hello, everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, depending on where you are. And so thank you for attending our session at FOSSASIA. My name is Evan Leibovich. I'm with Linux Professional Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome a panel to talk about careers in open source. So I'm going to ask each of the participants to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll go into the questions we have planned. So first, Ben, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Evan. Hi, everyone. My name is Ben. I'm based in the Philippines. I am a big free and open stuff advocate, open data, open source, open tech, open hardware. I work as a CTO for Smart City. We're a tech nonprofit based in the Philippines, working towards sustainable free and open solutions for smart city problems. But I also have a open data, open tech consultancy, BNHR, and currently also the data training lead for the Open Knowledge Foundation. So a lot of the work that I do involves a lot of open source. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Hong, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Evan. This is Hồng Phúc Đảng. I am the founder of FOSSASIA, also the organizer of the annual FOSSASIA Summit. So the mission of FOSSASIA is to improve people's lives through sharing open technologies and promote sustainable development and global connection. Besides the FOSSASIA Summit, I also serve on the board of the Open Source Business Alliance Germany, the board of the Open Source Committee in IEEE, and the Open Source Initiative. I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you.
Okay. And finally, Nithya, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Evan, and thank you, Hong, for putting FOSSASIA together. And this is my first time at FOSSASIA. Glad to be here. I currently am the chairwoman of the Linux Foundation Board of Directors, and I'm in between two roles. I'm just transitioning out of my role as Open Source Program Office lead for Comcast, and I will be taking over as the head of open source for Amazon starting Monday, the April 4th. I've been building bridges between open source communities and companies all my life, it seems like, and this is something that I enjoy doing, sharing opportunities in open source. So thank you for inviting me, Evan.
Okay, so thank you all for coming, and without further delay, we'll get into the first question. So the first question is, what are the different kinds of opportunities out there for people skilled in working with open source software within each sector? So Ben, would you like to go first?
Sure. That's actually a wonderful question to start this panel. So yeah, I mentioned during my introduction that I work or I serve a lot of roles. So one of the things that I do is open source consulting business here in the Philippines, where I do open data and open source consulting, providing support, training, and other consulting services to different organizations and individuals. So that's, of course, one of the most common things that you can do with open source skills and with open source software. Mostly my focus is on free and open source software for geospatial applications like geographic information systems. But based also on the other fields that I've worked in, I've noticed that sometimes there are several sectors that are overlooked when it comes to open source, but these sectors have like really great opportunities for open source and for someone with an open source background or open source skills to thrive in. And for me, this would be the humanitarian sector, the development sector, and also the advocacy sector. So a lot of the work that we do at Smart City and also at Open Knowledge revolves around this. In Smart City, we partner with uh, organizations, with the government, with other entities to provide solutions. And usually those solutions are built around open source for them to be more sustainable. And if you look actually at the humanitarian sector, a lot of the projects, a lot of the big impactful projects, like OpenStreetMap, for example, are open source, right? So people with these open source backgrounds, people who believe in this open source philosophy, who know how to work with open source software, there's always almost a space for them in the sectors, and it's just growing day by day. So for those who are interested in that, you can look at, as I mentioned, projects within OpenStreetMap, free and open source software for Geospatial, and of course, a lot of other things such as what we do, what Hong does with FOSSASIA, CodeHeat, and things like that. So yeah, for me, those are some of the opportunities from my experience, which would open up for people with skilled with open source or have experience working with open source software.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Hong, would you like to go next, please?
Yes. So I want to emphasize on what Ben said about the public sector. Ben mentioned there are a lot of opportunities these days when you want to get into public sector, and there is increasing investment from the government in the EU with like initiative to promote and foster open source development, not only in Europe but also in Asia, everywhere. So you see a lot of international NGO. There is program coming from the UN on digital public goods, where they constantly recruit open source experts for development work. So this is for the public sector. And Ben also mentioned about private consultancy. So we see also the numbers of private firms that established around open source consultancy, where people can make business with their knowledge in open source. So these are the new coming sector, but we need to we also need to see that in the private sector, for instance, in the tech industry, there are so many companies, software companies, digital companies. They are all built up from open source solution. So it hardly find any company that do not develop software based on open source. There are tons of opportunities for people, for developers who familiar with different open source technologies. And not only in the tech sector, we also see with the recent crisis, the corona pandemic, we see a lot of open source application that tackle health issue, that tackle climate change issue. So the scope of open source is not limited in software and technology sector anymore, but we see now in healthcare, in banking, in financial services, and many more. Yeah, and like before this panel, I actually read the blog post that Nisha wrote some time ago, where she mentioned different opportunities, not only for people who can write code, but also there are a lot of job families that people can engage and get opportunities with open source. And I would like to pass over to her, where she can explain to us more.
Thank you, Hong. Evan, you want me to go next?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think the public sector was well covered, and some of the private sector Hong has touched on. As Hong indicated, there are lots and lots and lots of jobs in the private sector, in the corporate world around open source. And development is something that you kind of think of immediately, right? Coding jobs, front end, back end, full stack, etc. but there really are a ton of other roles. For example, there are more and more companies that are starting open source program offices and community manager roles, DevRel roles, people writing documentation, doing translation, legal roles. Every company now almost has to have at least a part-time or a full-time open source savvy legal counsel. And that means that they have one foot in community and understand what community does, as well as how to interpret, legal licenses and agreements and things of that nature. So there's tons of jobs. The Linux Foundation annually does an open source jobs report, and I would recommend people check that out, because that summarizes, what companies are hiring for, what kinds of roles, what kinds of certifications companies are looking for. And I have to say, the other segment that was not covered is the academia. More and more universities are also creating curriculum around open source, and also influencing the rest of the university to think about open data, open science, open education, and not just, patent everything or keep everything as closed. So I love the fact that there are lots of opportunities in open source academia as well.
Okay, before we go on to the next question, is there anybody that wants to make a comment on something somebody else has said already?
Yes, so I don't have a comment, but I want to ask Nisha something. So you lead the open source at Comcast and now transit to heading the open source office in Amazon. So what exactly that you have to do for your job? What are your main responsibilities?
That's a great question, because that is one of the emerging jobs, and there are very few open source program office leaders or members. And if you go to the todogroup.org, you will find more information on what is an open source program office, what do they do, and what are some of the roles available in the program office. So my job is simply helping the company navigate open source, understand how to work with open source communities, foundations, organizations, and inside the company also help the company elevate their open source competencies, how to consume open source, how to contribute to open source. Compliance is a big part of open source program offices. How do you comply with licenses? Also doing a lot of evangelization for the company in terms of our work in open source and helping recruit open source program and engineers into the company. And to your point, Hound, a lot of engineers want to work for companies that are open source friendly, that allow them to work in open source and contribute to open source. And so it becomes a very big symbol for companies to have an open source program office in order to attract, retain, and develop open source engineers inside their companies.
So following up, Nithya, right now, would you say then that the open source program office, which has generally been something for large organizations and governments, is now going to start to see itself as a job placement, as a career opportunity in smaller organizations? Is that growing?
Yes. You're right, Evan. The larger companies have typically been the ones that have had, say, between 5 people and maybe 20, 30 people running their program offices. One of the oldest ones being Google and Intel and folks like that. Smaller companies can absolutely have one person or have volunteer group of many developers inside the company who spend part of their time doing the open source program office, advocacy, education, support type of role, and then continue to do their development role. And slowly you can emerge into creating more of a dedicated open source office as you see your work in open source increasing.
Excellent. In fact, if I recall, within the last few weeks, the World Health Organization became the first UN agency to create an open source program office. So hopefully that's a an inspiration to other organizations that want to consider this. Okay, for the second question, it's a long one, but hopefully it's got some good answers to it. So in entrepreneurship, what is the current state of open source software development within Southeast Asia? And can you, our panelists, identify any specific projects to which you'd like to call more attention that might reduce the dependence on projects coming from Europe and America? And so this time around, we'll start with Han.
Yes, so interesting question for open source development in Southeast Asia. I would say that it's growing. We can see in the number of contributors on GitHub or GitLab where they are coming from. So a lot of people, contributors are coming from Asia. And I would say that the landscape, the development landscape in terms of open source in Asia, it's how you say, is formalized, grouping around like different interests of people, different technologies. So you see a lot of technology groups like Python, Java, or a certain like framework view for JS, for example. So people get together in terms of like the type of technology that they are into, and they continue to work together, share the knowledge on this. Like if you talk about the state, it's difficult to mention to say here, because the state of open source development, it could be what I mentioned just now, where people voluntarily organize themselves around different groups. We also see the endorsement from the governments from different countries. One example from Southeast Asia, as you mentioned, is Singapore. Singapore is a very good example that we can look into for several years. They have set up something called the open data. This is quite strong in Singapore, where they release a lot of public data for the community to develop solutions based on this data set. And a few years ago, they started to invest more in open source by having like a lot of new initiatives and projects coming from GovTech. And related a little bit to careers opportunities, they hire a lot of open source developers in Singapore, in the Singapore hackerspace and the user group in the country. So we can see that it's going and it's like really growing. In Vietnam, the country where I came from, they also set up the open source FOSSA, the Vietnam Open Source Group, and sponsored by the Ministry of Information and Technology. So they've been around for a while already, also advocating for open source developments and open source interest group. Yeah, so they support different language group to grow the community and also to work together on projects. So I think Ben can tell more a little bit about other Southeast Asia countries. I would just give these two examples to answer the first half of your question. The second half of the question about identifying any projects that are worthy of broader attention and that reduce dependence on projects based in the EU or in America. So I would say something like this. So when you look at any open source project, it's really difficult to say that it's an Asian project or it's European project, because open source, it means open for collaboration, and a lot of contributors in any project are come from everywhere. So we cannot say that, okay, so this is the purely Asian project or this is an American project, because in one way or another, there will be contributors coming from other parts of the world. Yeah, but I would like to take the opportunity to share a few projects of FOSS Asia, even though FOSSASIA is based out of Singapore. The main maintainers and a lot of contributors are coming from Europe and other continents as well. But I would like to mention this project Event is an open source event management system that we use to run the FOSSASIA Summit. So it's developed entirely open source. It started by FOSSASIA as a Singaporean-based, Vietnamese-based company, and the opportunity with the event. So, of course, in order to sustain any open source projects, you need to have a commercial model. How do you gonna get the funding to continue to grow the project, either through donation or any like business models? And FOSSASIA develop event in that way, where we not only rely on donation, but we also help the people use the system and pay for service. So you get service fee similar to other commercial service like Eventbrite, subscription fee for example. And this is one of the example how open source can find a way to get resources to continue their development. And I want to say that with this event, we offer constantly looking out for developers and engineers who can join our development team. So this is one example in terms of software that coming out of Asia. Dependency, of course, we use we develop event. We also plug in different platforms. For instance, Big Blue Button is not a project developed in Asia, but it's another project developed in the West, right? But we still have the collaboration, integrated the solution inside the software. So if you want to see a very clear barrier, border or barrier, is difficult to say. And I want to also mention another project of FOSSASIA is the Pocket Science Lab. So Pocket Science Lab is a hardware project, open source hardware project, where we develop a device that enables students and teachers to make a science experiment so that they can learn science subject, they can learn electronics with a real affordable device. So the Pocket Science Lab, we've been developed this project for quite some years already. We distribute the hardware throughout the world, so you can get it online anywhere around the world, in the US, Europe, or in Asia. And this is also another example when you talk about entrepreneurship, how you can turn an open source project into something that's sustainable, something that you can generate an income to support your further development. So
okay.
I would finish it here.
Okay. Matthew, could you go next?
I think I just want to make one point. I'm not very familiar with too many Southeast Asia projects, but I just want to make the point that Han did, which is open source is global, and open source really needs to continue to be open and boundaryless and global. And I would hate to see it being, there's this kind of some techno-nationalism happening, and it would be good to not become so focused on how can we do open source that's only relevant to that country, but make it more global. But having said that, I also want to say there is a role, though, for different countries in Southeast Asia to invest in education, invest in making open source more open and available, and provide more opportunities for people to get involved in open source. And I think Hong also mentioned some encouragement that's needed from governments to really encourage people to use open source and to work in open source, and start foundations and organizations to encourage open source. So I would say that is more needed than having projects that are specific to Southeast Asia.
Okay, thanks. And Ben.
Okay, so I'll double down or triple down on what both Hong and Nithya mentioned about the open source being global. So I think that's one of the beauties of it. you can't really put a nationality on an open source project. Of course, you can say that the founders based on this country or the very first developers are probably based on one part of the world, but a large open source project would have contributors, not just developers. You have translators, you have your people who write documentation all around the globe. So it's a real big global project. So it's really hard to pinpoint something like, this is a Southeast Asian project, as Hong said, or this is a European project. But what I'd also like to add, and this is something that Hong mentioned as well, it's mostly what I've noticed is it's about building communities around these open source projects that are local, that could address the local issues around that project, around that piece of software, um, which you could then, for example, relay to the larger board, for example, or the people who actually make some of the decisions for the larger project as a whole, right? So one of the examples that I think I can show is in the free and open source software for geospatial field. QGIS is one of the biggest projects that I can think of, and slowly but surely there are there are communities around QGIS that are springing up in Southeast Asia. I know QGIS Indonesia is active. QGIS Philippines is also active. So even though QGIS is a global, no, it's a global project. It's a geographic information system. The things that it does isn't just focused on the problem of a single country or a single region, but because of these local communities, right, you are able to adapt that project to the local needs. One example that I remember was one of the users of QGIS in the Philippines noticed that there was a problem with one of the coordinate reference systems in QGIS, which is Philippine based. So if no one from the Philippines was using that piece of software, we would never know that that issue actually exists. So beyond that idea of this piece of software being based on this region or not, I think what the open source community needs more are these local communities that actually um, help support the growth of the open source project within their communities, within their countries, within their region, for example. So, for example, FOSS Asia is, even though as Hong said, it's based in Singapore, but it has connected together a lot of the local communities in the different countries in Southeast Asia and in Asia as a whole, for example. So, for me, in terms of, I can't really pinpoint any projects that I can say, that these are Southeast Asian projects that reduce dependence on projects based in Europe and America. But what I can pinpoint would be the communities around these projects that really help support, the growth of open source in Southeast Asia, the growth of open source technologies, open source education, open source hardware. So for me, it really boils down to the question of community in terms of this question, and that community also ties in a bit to the entrepreneurship aspect of it, because communities help build businesses, right? If you don't have a community to support you, people who will be your users, no matter how good the software is, if people don't use it, then it won't really grow, and it won't really be something, or it won't really be a business venture worth looking into. So yeah, community is a big deal. Basically, is what I'm saying.
Actually, that's a great point, Ben. If I could ask the panelists, if you had any advice to give to anybody listening to this about how to start or get involved in a local community, how they would go about doing that. I know that in my local area, creating Linux user groups sometimes has been a bit of a challenge. So do any of you have any advice that you'd want to offer anyone listening to this who might want to get involved locally like that?
Yes, so I would say before you think of starting something yourself, maybe look around to see what are the active communities out there already. So, to get together. So normally how community organize is the event you mentioned, there are Linux user groups everywhere. In any major city that I'm aware of, there is a Linux user group, but there's also a language specific technology groups. So it really depends on your interest and the topic that you care about. If you just search for like a community around your area, you definitely will find something. And check out their website. They normally have regular meetings, meet up where they welcome new members. So I can talk for Singapore. There is already the FOSS Singapore community. They have regular meeting organized on meetup.com every month, and there is the hackerspace inside in Singapore where you can easily go there, get information. And in Vietnam, also several communities. So Docker is quite popular in Vietnam. There is that FOSSA community I mentioned earlier. And of course, I want to promote again the FOSSASIA community. We are very active on GitHub. We have projects on GitHub and everywhere. So if you want to learn about open source, you want to get in touch with us, check out FOSSASIA on GitHub. So our community members, contributors of different projects are there to help you to get on board with your open source journey.
Great. Okay, moving on to the third question. Globally, the appeal of IT careers to women does not appear to be as rising as quickly as many hoped. What do you see as the greatest continuing obstacles to this happening? And so this time, Nithya, you'll go first.
Yes, thank you so much, Evan. And you're right, there are a number of studies. I think GitHub did a study about the percentage of people identifying as women contributing to open source or involved in open source. Linux Foundation did that. And most of the studies tend to show less than 10% women. It varies from 2 to 10. I think some of the challenge is people not identifying their gender online because of the backlash sometimes with contributions coming from women not being accepted or treated equally to contributions coming from men. So a lot of people may not reveal their gender. So that aside, I think some of the challenges have been the reputation of open source sometimes, right? There'll be 1 or 2 projects that are very unfriendly or have a culture of not encouraging new contributors or treating you as if you don't know what you're doing, verbally insulting you or creating a hostile environment. So those types of reputation sometimes tends to spread very fast. And so people get nervous about getting involved. The truth of the matter is there are some really, really good communities out there which are working very, very hard to create inclusive communities, whether it's Python or Drupal or Django or, some really good communities that are contributing. So culture is one piece. The second is just not knowing how to get involved. What's the first step? How do I find something to contribute to when there are millions and millions and millions of repos on GitHub? So organizations like Google Summer of Code or Outreachy or the Linux Foundation's diversity mentorship really make it easy to start getting involved in open source because they match you up to a mentor and a project. And it's almost a 3 months sometimes with Google Summer of Code in the summer, or with Outreachy, it's 6 months mentorship. So they actually walk you through how to get involved and how to contribute to open source. And I think those types of mentorship programs are fantastic. And Hong and Ben also indicated local communities. I think local communities are really fantastic in holding your hand, in getting you involved in, in small steps towards becoming a part of the open source community, whether it's attending your first user group, meeting someone and feeling comfortable and feeling like you belong. And next thing you know, you are regularly attending them, and maybe you're volunteering to do something, or you're doing a talk. As a user of open source, you could do a talk on how you used it. And then next thing you know, you are filing an issue, filing a bug, and then you're fixing something small in documentation, and it starts kind of building up from there. So I would say getting started, taking that first step is important to overcoming some of those obstacles.
Okay, Ben?
Okay, yeah. So I have to say I've been really fortunate to have had a chance to work with really wonderful women, and also to have had a chance to meet them. In the Philippines, we have a really vibrant local community, not just of tech, but I'll be specifically mentioning the open mapping community in the Philippines, the OpenStreetMap community, the free and open source software for geospatial community. We have a really vibrant community, and one of the main actors there are actually women. We have a Geo Ladies group who are these wonderful women working with open source geospatial. And not just women, we also have mapbecs, which are for people who identify as members of the LGBT, who map out safe spaces for the LGBT community. And GeoLadies, they map out areas and spaces for women. So I've been really fortunate to have had a chance to work with these people, with these women. And what I've noticed, based on the years that I've met them, or I've worked with them, is, one of the biggest things really that men can do in this space, because in the end there's still men would still need to to do something about this. It's not just putting the burden everything on women. So one of the biggest things that we can do is just to step aside, and that's something that I've noticed in the vibrant community we have in the Philippines. You can just step aside, allow these women to take space, grow their own communities, do their own projects, without someone mansplaining to them what they're doing, without someone telling them that it should be like this, it should be like that. It shouldn't be that hard for us to step aside and let them lead. There's no harm in that. I don't see any issues in that, not just in the tech space, but in a lot of spaces. So for me, I've had this wonderful experience, and hopefully this translates more to the larger tech community. But in the open mapping space in the Philippines, I'm very proud to say that we have probably one of the most vibrant communities out there. And a lot of these wonderful women have found their space even outside of the Philippines, working for other organizations outside of the country. So yeah, for me, still one of the greatest continuing obstacles are men. So we need to be able to just step aside, let this wonderful women do their thing.
Okay, and Hong, you get the last word on this.
Yes, so I want to confirm what Ben said about the women leaders in open source in the Philippines. I got a chance to work together with some of them, and I must say that I was very impressed about their dedication, their energy, how their commitment into the community and what they are doing. So I was very impressed. I just want to add a little bit on the obstacles that we mentioned here. So I think that the IT careers for women is not growing so fast as we hope, because we are not given the opportunities. So we need more companies, corporation to give the opportunities to women in the IT sector. So more women in leadership. Ben also mentioned the men are there, but not only about they being themselves, they willing to step aside, but in the corporate setting, if there are opportunities for promotion, opportunity to take on leadership positions, it is like still unlikely that this kind of opportunities will be given to women if there are also other like male candidates inside the company. So this is what I have seen so far, and and I hope that with this panel and the conversation we have here, we are advocating for corporates out there to look into this matter and giving more opportunities to women, especially in the leadership route. And something that Nisha mentioned earlier, I also want to share my opinion on this about culture. So sometimes you mentioned that some community is not so friendly to women, but I also think that is about the perception of women, you know, in terms of cultural differences. When we see an unfriendly comments from someone from a project, we assume that it was because we are a woman, but actually sometimes they have they use the same type of communication to other people as well. But so, but it's a little bit like difficult for women on to take on like some really harsh comments or criticism. Yeah, so nobody like criticism, and also even like more for us, right? So we grew up in the culture that really gentle, really calm, and sometimes we feel it's really hard to accept. But I must say that if we look at it in a different angles, we could see that the way some people, it's just their style of communication is not only, it's not because of us. They just their way that they talk to anyone, and it could help us to how, how do we say um, lessen a little bit our pressure and our like hesitant in participate in those communities. Yeah.
Just
Okay.
just to add to what Hang said, I think we've got to take it less personally is what Hang also is saying, because it's just the way some people communicate. And once we get past that, then we realize that we can still continue to work in that community. And second thing I wanted to say is the more diversity you have in companies and in open source communities, the culture starts changing. The culture starts becoming more inclusive, more kind and appreciative, and a sense of gratitude. And the only way to change the culture is to include more people in the culture.
So tying this together with the last question then, is there anything that you would recommend from the people on this panel of, say, how local communities can get more involved in actively promoting inclusion as opposed to just the regular way things are? Is there anything that could be done at the local community level, not waiting for employers or others? Any suggestions?
I really love what Ben said, which is, today the majority are men. If they can intentionally and actively step aside and allow the women and other diverse members in their community to shine, be an ally, be a supporter, and help them, onboard them, help them, do things. And whenever you see, I think FOSSASIA does a great job here when you're compiling your group for steering committees or governance of organizations, look intentionally for diverse candidates. When you're looking for speakers at a conference, look for diverse candidates, because the representation matters. When people see people as leaders, when people see people as speakers and doing, big things, then they say, I can do it too. And it gives them more confidence to feel like this is a community that will include me. So I think the local communities can do a great deal of things. Last one I'll say is code of conduct. If you create actively a code of conduct as a local community or an event and say, we will not tolerate any kind of discrimination or bad behavior in this community, and we will actively enforce getting people out if they are not creating inclusive communities, I think that goes a long way as well.
Excellent. Well, I think we've had enough time within the space given to properly handle 3 questions. Before we close off, could we just go around the table one more time and just for everybody to sort of give a brief, couple of minute conclusion on anything you've heard here, or any other last comments you'd like to give or advice to our listeners? Again, we'll start from like the beginning with Ben.
Okay, so I guess based on what we've talked about and based on what the answers have been, we see that community plays a really large role from the grassroots until you reach like the top of the corporate ladder in terms of IT, because what happens in the community level, the kind of culture that it breeds, the kind of diversity that it has, or the kind of people who actually join those communities, they are also usually the ones who thrive and also get pushed to these higher and higher positions, which then allow them to give back to that community and grow that community based on what they've learned or what they've gotten from the original community that they were part of. So for me, for those listening, don't be afraid of joining open source, open tech communities. Or if there's something that you're really interested in and no one is started it, don't be afraid to start your own. There's always people like-minded. There's always like-minded people. There's always people like you who are probably just waiting for someone to start something. A Raspberry Pi group, a group very focused on monitoring plants. You can probably find your people, your community. Just don't be afraid of joining or creating these communities built around openness, built around open source, built around open tech. And yeah, I hope in the future some of you will be part of FOSSASIA or part of the other conferences that we have around the region on open source and open tech and open data. So yeah, for me that's basically it.
Great, thank you. Hong.
Yes, so Ivan, I want to thank you for organizing this panel, for giving us the opportunity to share our ideas, our experience to the wider communities. And I believe that we should have more conversation like this, where we can talk to people, where we can show them some, opportunities that they can take on, as Pen and Nisha already mentioned earlier. So to sum up, I just want to say that there are a lot of opportunities in open source. You just need to go out there. You just need to participate. And I also believe that anything can be learned. So as long as you give enough time and enough effort, you will master it eventually. And I just want to say that open source brought me where I am today. I'm super happy with what I am doing every day. And I also feel very satisfied and motivated for something that I do, because I feel that I create an impact also in the society by doing open source. And please join us, join the community, and start to engage today.
Okay, and Nithya, you get the last word today.
Thank you, Evan, and thank you for organizing this. I want to say 3 things. One, there's tremendous opportunity in open source to make a living, to make a career, and to have a sense of mission. That's what keeps us all, I think, in open source. The second is There's so many community-led ways to get involved in open source. Unlike other technologies where you have to go to school or you have to enroll in a college, open source you can do on your own. You can get involved in a project or a community and start, contributing. And third, I want to say is open source is not only about technology. It is about all kinds of careers. So if you are a marketing person and creative person, or you're a documentation person, or you love community organization, or you love to create inclusive communities or legal, anyone can contribute to open source and bring their skill sets and their superpowers to open source. So get involved in your local community.
Okay, and I guess the one thing that is sort of unspoken is that the three of you offer fantastic examples of the kind of careers that people can have in open source, because you're all doing it. You're all setting a fantastic example, I think, for the people that are here at this session. So unfortunately, because of the format, we're not able to take direct questions from people in the audience. If you have some, please send them to me, and I will try and forward them to the speakers. But in the meantime, on behalf of myself and everybody at Linux Professional Institute, I want to thank our speakers, to Ben, to Hong, to Nithya. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you all for attending, and thank you for coming to FOSS Asia. And we hope you have a great time at the rest of the conference. Thanks.